panel will present both sides of the issue of sanctioned forest collaboratives as a means of developing forest projects and policy. Each of our 4 panelists will have 8 minutes to present their presentation and perspective on the issue. They'll go one by one, and once each person has finished their presentation, everyone will have 4 minutes to provide a response to what the other panelists have shared. So it should be a lively and exciting conversation. We'll try to save some room for questions at the end as well, so definitely make note of those as we go. Okay, our very first panelist is Rick Bailey. Rick is a forest and wilderness advocate and has been for the past 51 years. He's a former logger, a wildland firefighter, a river guide, and he's also the author of Lone Dream, Chronicles of a Reluctant Wilderness Activist. So I'm going to let Rick take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We've got a construction crew coming in to make the room bigger. So, well, 51 years, folks. I've been a wilderness and forest advocate for 51 years. And it's really good to be here and see the next generation come again. Actually, probably 2 generations below me. But in my 51 years of doing this, I've sat at the table with all kinds of different people. And my favorite meetings were with people who did not agree with my positions on public land management. You develop understandings, you develop trust. It's great. Sometimes you even agree on the issues. And when you do that, you can go right to the decision leaders, Congress, or the federal agencies, and say, hey, we've got something going here. We found some common ground. That, folks, is collaboration with a little c, a lowercase c. What I and many other people have a big problem with, especially the way it's being carried out these days, is collaboration with a capital C. What that means is federally sanctioned, oftentimes federally funded groups who have exclusive access to information and influence. I moved to the Methow Valley 12 years ago to retire. I was getting out of activism. I was going to leave it to my cohorts at the time, but I was going to leave it to the next generation coming up to protect our public lands. But after I moved to the Methow, I found that there were these projects. Of course, they were called things like fuels reduction. They were called restoration. But I looked and found out that these projects were no different than the timber sales that we've been fighting for decades. It was a shock. And it's still shocking. The most shocking thing about it is the advocates that I had worked with were supporting these projects. Projects that were in defiance of law, in defiance of rules like the Northwest Forest Plan. And I dug even deeper and found this. This is done by a reporter who looked at old Freedom of Information Act responses from the highest levels of the Forest Service and found that the Forest Service was huddling with timber industry lobbyists to figure out how they could exploit the fear of fire and turn it into more board feed production from the national forests. Next, I've got meeting minutes. So where do the collaboratives fall on this? Well, this is part of the meeting minutes of the North Central Washington Forest Health Collaborative. And as you can see, what they're concerned about, they don't talk about wildlife protection. They don't talk about complying with the Northwest Forest Plan or NEPA or anything else. They talk about targets. And by targets, that's timber targets. So my concern is that the public is being usurped by some of these collaboratives. Now, there's some of them that are different, but the ones I've been exposed to are basically taking over the public discussion. The Forest Service in Methow, where I live, has not held a single public meeting to discuss these projects publicly. They have not published a notice of the existence of these projects in the local newspaper. Meanwhile, the collaborative does not respond to inquiries, and they've closed their meetings. When their meetings are a part of discussing these projects, they close them. I've been kicked out twice. So I'm going to caveat that by saying that there are good people working in the collaboratives. Some of these collaboratives have got great people who want to be involved in ecologically responsible ways of reducing wildfire risk. There are good people within the Forest Service. I know a lot of them, but they're not calling the shots. So what we've got is a situation where, see if I can get my slides here. This was authorized by a collaborative. Now, I've got all kinds of slides like this, and I don't want to get a war over slides here. So I'll just kind of leave you with this one, this cartoon. But anyway, I want to emphasize, folks, that all we have to protect public lands is law. That's all we have. And I hear people talk about litigation. Litigation is all we've been left with to fight these projects. It's all we've been left with. That's the only opportunity we've had to influence these projects. People say we don't want to do litigation because it's confrontational. We want to go with collaboration. I'm all for collaboration, but they shouldn't have an inside track to the federal agencies putting these projects together. So, don't forget, folks, please, that in order to protect our public lands, contrary to what the speaker said, the keynote speaker said, Mr. Good keynote speech, but contrary to what he said, all we have to protect public land is law, and we have to enforce it. So let's collaborate. Let's sit down with people on all sides of the issue. Let's talk, but let's have a democratic system of managing public lands where we have a level playing field where everybody has equal opportunity to be involved. That's what I've got, folks. Thank you for your attention. I hope can you read the bottom? It's really kind of...
Yeah, I love that last note.
Anyway, that's all thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Rick. Our next panelist is Mitch Friedman. He's the founder and executive director of Conservation Northwest and the author of Conservation Confidential, his recounting of strategies learned over a long and effective activist career. Thank you, Mitch.
I don't have 51 years. I only have 41 years. And I've learned a few things over that time. I started out just east of here. I was one of the first tree sitters in what was at that time the Millennium Grove, the oldest trees in Oregon. We lost that one, but we learned a lot. And over the next few years, I was busted a dozen times. I was an Earth First leader in Washington and found it. I'm been trained as a natural scientist. So in the early days of conservation biology, I had these ideas of how to use what I'd learned about advocacy to get conservation biology concepts put on the ground. And that's where I founded this organization in '89. And for the first 10 or so years, the tools we were using were mostly litigious, mostly the stick. Some successes. And then about 25 years ago, some younger people that didn't have the cultural baggage that old war horses like Rick and I had wanted to try something new. And they wanted a full trip with timber beasts, the mill owners on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, Southwest Washington. And they came back with big eyes and they said, they don't want to cut old growth anymore. Their mills don't want the big logs. They can do everything they want with second growth logs. We have something in common. And that's the origin story, the creation myth of collaboration in my life, in my story. And over the last 25 years, we've used that tactic. So not just the stick, but the carrot and the stick. Relationships with the agencies, relationships in the communities, relationships with industry, both timber and ranching. We've used these techniques to make Washington the best place to be a wolf of any of the wolf states by collaborating, helping ranchers deter wolf conflict, helping them pay for and train the fancy cowboys that keep the peace and minimize wolf blood. We support them when a wolf needs to be killed. They work with us to minimize the chances those wolves would need to be killed. we've had incredible successes. Stand level in Northeast Washington on the Caldwell National Forest. We took a combative relationship with the timber industry to agreement that a third of that forest should be managed for wildlands, should be wilderness. We couldn't get it done, but now because we didn't have timber industry support, but there were other obstacles to legislating there. And a third of the forest should be managed, restored to natural fire cycle conditions, big trees, remove the little ones, and a third of the forest on an ongoing, sustainable timber management to provide jobs and community benefits. Agreement at the landscape level at a 1 million acre national forest with the timber industry. Agreement at the stand level, improving stand conditions. I have staff across the state. We've, even on the west side, we've used these tactics, collaborative tactics, to agree on how to restore second growth old clear cuts, 40 to 60-year-old regenerated clear cuts, where you're thinning with ecological objectives to accelerate the timeline to old growth conditions, while using some of those revenues to fix the streams, to rip out some of the roads, to put that forest on a track towards, ecological health in ways that we were never able to efficiently do just with the stick. There's places we disagree, right? One of the projects that Rick's talking about, my staff have been involved in, and take a different view. We certainly agree with Rick that the Forest Service, that the loggers cut too many big trees. At the same time, and that project had, 1,800 acres of variable density thinning, all on frozen ground to protect soils. 8,300 acres of non-commercial thinning. 10,000 acres of prescribed burn over 15 years. 35 miles of decommissioned road. Undersized culverts replaced for salmon, all through the negotiation. And we don't even like that collaborative. I mean, the title of this was it Panacea or Pitfall? It's both. It's neither. Some collaboratives are functional, efficient, and effective. They tend to be organic ones based on relationships. Sometimes, things change over time. The other side figures things out, learns and adapts, or you get a bad leader in the Forest Service and a public agency, and they'll tend to co-opt something. But, even now, with this president and this administration rolling back laws, the places where we've had healthy collaboratives and have good relationships, those are the places where we feel we have non-litigation tools through our relationships with timber industry. They knew they could call on us when there's Democratic presidents. We knew we could call on them when there's Republican ones. And it becomes a backstop to keep things moving forward. So, how much time?
2.5 minutes.
There's a bigger point here. And it's not just about forests and wildlands. It's about America. I think activism is broken. I struggle to think of an instance where we've been effective as advocates, as activists, to create change, with the best example of success, or maybe the only one recently, being Minneapolis. We're good organizers with experience, coupled with normies, right? People in the PTAs and things like that, put up a fight against ICE and succeeded by mainstream. But so many of our activist causes, including environmental, we've overplayed our hands. Maybe we accomplished our objectives, but then faced a backlash. Maybe we contributed to discord in the communities that led to populism. How does an a-hole like Trump win unless there's a sense of chaos and alienation? And if we as activists are contributing to that by polarizing is a tactic that the other side uses in order to gain control and roll things back. So as advocates, we may not always get what we want through collaboration, but we damn well ought to try every time because there's risk in the more polarizing tactics that might feel cathartic when times are urgent and you feel like desperate and you're wrapped up in a cause. It's awfully tempting to polarize. And maybe you'll get to your objective, but then maybe you'll be contributing to a backlash that will roll back the progress you've made. And we always have to keep that in mind. I think that's enough.
That was perfect. 7 minutes. I think that. Okay, our next panelist is James Johnston. James is an academic expert in fire and ecology, restoration, environmental law policy, and collaborative governance. He's published more than 40 peer-reviewed papers in the past 10 years. I've published one, so good job.
Thank you. Well, I forget if Mitch said this or not, but there is a extended version of that lecture in book form. It makes a great dartboard. There's Mitch's face right there. I guess I'm the young one in this crowd. I was thinking about it the very first time that I woke up really way too early to sit my ass in a logging road to try and stop a timber sale was almost 37 years ago to the date, which makes me a spring chicken in this crowd. Yes, I am old enough to remember when this is what Forest Service logging in Western Oregon, where I was born and raised, looked like. I consider it one of my major arguments for still being allowed to consume oxygen on this planet that I played a very minor role in the movement that ended this type of logging in Western Oregon. Today, this is what Forest Service logging looks like. This is Eastern Oregon, and it's pretty typical of what Forest Service logging looks like. This is before, and this is after. I hope you can tell it's the exact same scene, before and after thinning. These are just sort of randomly selected photos from thinning shows in Eastern Oregon. This is what Forest Service logging looks like these days. Here's another example of a somewhat more controversial sale. Controversial because, grand fir like that's a 27-inch grand fir that's somewhere between 80 and 100 years old. I wouldn't be able to reach the center of it before. But those trees were removed in order to increase the survivability of the real old growth in the Stass 300-plus-year-old ponderosa pine. And to a lot of people, these sorts of scenes are pretty disturbing. I've been really blessed to be an academic studying these systems and studying ecosystem response to this type of thinning. Learned really a lot about how these ecosystems are responding to thinning. As you'd expect, there's a short-term increase in fire probability, reaction intensity, flame length, etc., followed by a dramatic decline in modeled fire severity, and modeled fire severity declines for decades after implementation of these shows. One of the more exciting things that learning is these types of thinning operations significantly increase native biodiversity. This graph is showing you native biodiversity before in 2014 and several years after thinning operations, almost doubling the diversity of species that are in these sites, decreasing the rigor of residual trees, increasing the survivability of old growth. We can prove that with quantitative data. Some of the most exciting work we're doing in Eastern Oregon now is quantifying pollinator community response to thinning, and notice a significant increase in pollinator diversity as a result of thinning. We are relinking characteristic patterns and processes that make these stands resilient. This is a stand that was thinned a couple, 5-6 years ago, 2 years ago, and experienced wildfire. We're getting exactly the sort of responses to wildfire. After we remove some of these young trees, we're still losing a couple of trees to, fire mortality. But overall, we're getting really healthy, resilient stands as a result of this sort of thing. This is one of my favorite shots from the, kind of this randomly selected longer green plot. Here's a stand that was pretty heavily thinned in order to stimulate aspen. And sure enough, just a couple of years after thinning, we get this extraordinary aspen response and all the associated biodiversity that's associated with restoring aspen communities. All of this work is done collaboratively. Stakeholder groups in Eastern Oregon and other places are getting together to plan these operations. I find this to be kind of a no-brainer. We're stabilizing carbon storage. We are producing good jobs in rural communities. We're enhancing forest resilience and native biodiversity. There are arguments that can and do get made against this type of thinning. I think that most of those arguments are spurious, and I think that I can prove that with data. But I'll leave it at that and move on to chat.
Okay. Thank you, James. Last but not least, we have Chad Hanson. Chad is a wildfire scientist with the John Muir Project. He is the author of the 2021 book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Thank you, Chad.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Chad Hanson. I'm a wildfire scientist with the John Muir Project. I'm going to talk to you a little bit first about my experience in a collaborative. And I agree with Rick's point that there's small C collaboration and there's big C collaboratives, government-sponsored collaboratives that have a very, very different character than just simply talking to people and working with people, including those who with whom you disagree, which is small C collaboration. I was involved for about 3.5 years in a big C collaborative. When I first started it, I thought, I have concerns, but I'm going to get involved in it and see if I can do some good, or maybe even just prevent some bad things from happening. When I first got involved, we were told that all decision making would be by consensus. And it turned out that some of us, me as a wildfire scientist and a few environmental group representatives, didn't agree with the things the Forest Service was proposing or what the representatives of the logging industry, who were there in numbers, were proposing. And so none of those decisions or proposals were getting group consensus. And so the Forest Service changed the rules to say it's going to be modified consensus, so that if a supermajority of people agree, then that would be the recommendation of the collaborative. And basically what that did was it sort of compartmentalized the minority of people who were raising concerns about biodiversity and about logging impacts. But then opposition to the logging began to grow, and more people began to say, you know what, we like a different sort of path, a different solution. And a majority, almost a majority, supported a different type of project where it was about prescribed fire, and it was about a little bit of thinning, but really more small trees, and but it didn't quite have majority support. But it was more than the modified consensus, and so it was enough to get the Forest Service's attention. They changed the rules again and said, okay, now it's going to be a majority rule, not modified consensus. Because it just didn't seem politically possible that a majority of people would oppose what the Forest Service was proposing. That changed, and then a majority actually started recommending that the Forest Service just do prescribed burning, manage wildfires, some snag creation through girdling in places where there weren't enough snags for wildlife. And that became the majority opinion on the next project that was coming up. And once that happened, the Forest Service just said, we are not obliged to take any recommendation from the collaborative whatsoever. And so even majority opinion was rejected and ignored. So I raised a concern that it seemed to me the Forest Service was pursuing timber targets on this national forest. And that's really what was driving it. When you had a majority of the collaborative saying we should go in a different direction, and the Forest Service says, no, we're just going to keep doing logging projects. And the district ranger said, no, absolutely not. There's no timber target. This is all about forest health and fuel reduction. And it's all about making the forest more ecologically sound. So I left that meeting and I got in my car, I was driving away, and one of the Forest Service staff comes running out with a printout in his hand, and he asked me to stop. I rolled down my window and he hands it to me, and it's one of their documents internal that wasn't shared with the group that shows all their timber targets right down to the board for it. And he said, yeah, they were lying to you. I just don't feel right about it. So I wanted to give you this. I said, what's going on here? And he shook his head and he raised his hands. He said, "Hey man, timber is king," and he walked off. He didn't last long after that. They soon got rid of it. So I began to ask more inconvenient questions about what was the basis for the narrative that the forests historically were very open and park-like and low density. And there were very, very few trees per acre, which is what they were telling us. And they cited some research, and I looked into that research. And it turns out what I found when I went to the original sources of these historical documents is that the Forest Service scientists had excluded 94% of the historical data in order to promote the narrative that the forests were very low density, and therefore removing most of the trees would restore the forests. And what I found is that 94% included lots of evidence of very dense forests, of large high-intensity fire patches, a much more dynamic forest ecosystem. There were open areas, but there were also extremely dense areas. I brought this to their attention, and I was told that the collaborative had to agree, everyone involved with the collaborative had to agree on a set of basic beliefs, and these were written down, and that the evidence I was sending to them, which were historical U.S. government records, that evidence was not consistent with those beliefs. And they told me I needed to physically sign an agreement that I would support the set of beliefs that were written down that were contrary to the science I was bringing to their attention, and that I could not speak in any way contrary to that. And that was the only way I could continue to participate in the collaborative. Essentially, sign the loyalty oath or leave. So I left. That was my experience with collaboratives. So there's research out there. There are studies out there that tell us that the forests were very low density historically, that tell us that removing trees from forests are necessary or helpful or effective in reducing fire intensity, that it's good for biodiversity. There's lots of research out there, typically by Forest Service scientists or scientists funded by the Forest Service. What I want to focus on, how am I doing with time?
Well, you have 2 minutes remaining.
All right. What I want to focus on for the next 2 minutes is what you're not being told, and all the research out there that's really not being discussed by the folks who are promoting thinning. Number one, failure to account for tree mortality from thinning itself. Absolutely, if some of the surviving trees, the trees that are not logged, there will be some effect on growth. Sometimes growth rate will go up. What was the cost of getting that tiny little benefit? Oftentimes these thinning projects are removing 60, 70, 80%, killing and removing 60, 70, 80% of the trees in a given stand. That's become much more typical these days. So not taking into account tree mortality from thinning itself, which is oftentimes the largest source of mortality. Study sites being subjectively chosen and counterexamples omitted. Claims about thinning and fire based on hypothetical modeling, not actual data and actual fires. Oftentimes stated results that contradict the conclusions in the conclusion section of the thinning studies. Omission of abundant historical evidence, usually from the agencies themselves, about very, very dense forests. So basically, selective presentation of the historical record. And an ecological rationale that's lacking as to why high-intensity fire must categorically be prevented. We know now, scientifically, that there are many native species, plant and animal, that depend specifically on high-intensity fire for the habitat, for the food they need to survive. And last, refusal to acknowledge the abundant scientific evidence that contradicts the narrative that forests are burning too intensely because they're overgrown and they're too dense. And therefore, they must be thinned. So there's a ton of research out there from different scientists, a lot of them Forest Service scientists, 30-year analyses, 10-year analyses, hundreds of scientific of fires analyzed, finding that thinned areas actually burn more intensely, that dense forests burn less intensely. And this is not being conveyed to the public. It's not being conveyed to the conservation community. And so this is just a small subset of these. You can go into the John Muir Project's website, onto our public education page, scroll down to the bottom, and you will find fact sheets with dozens and dozens of citations to studies that you're not being told about. And I'll wrap it up there for now, and then I'll cover some more things with my last 4 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all 4 of our panelists for an amazing initial presentation. We are now going to give everyone 4 minutes to respond to the comments that were made by their colleagues. Each person will have 4 minutes to respond, and then we'll move on to our next panelist. And good news, it looks like we will have some ample time for audience questions as well. So we'll begin with Rick.
That's what I'm anxious for, is some questions. I don't want to get up here and pee on everybody else's success stories, but I think there's room in the environmental movement for collaboration and for advocacy. It's not like we're proposing to do one and not the other. So I'm going to do the advocacy. I love to talk to people, especially loggers, because I can talk logger with them. I used to be a logger. We're going to keep talking, and we're going to find common ground. But I think the common ground that's found on thinning projects is pretty tenuous, because we're actually going out there and protecting big trees, but we don't want to just protect individual trees. We want to protect forest ecosystems. Now, Mitch pointed out a success story about a timber company not wanting to cut big trees. Well, that's because there's very few mills that will handle big trees anymore. And I'm not going to depend on the goodwill of the timber industry, who has only one man motivation in order to manage our public forests. I think it's really important to remember that we don't know what historic conditions are. The east side forests of east of the Cascades in the Sierra Nevada, we think we have historic conditions mapped out, but we don't have nearly enough information to determine what those historic conditions were. And besides, you can't just go out and look at a photograph or a bunch of photographs of a forest from 100 years ago and say, that's what the forest looked like then, so that's what it's supposed to look like all the time. It doesn't wash. And what we're doing, folks, is we are trying to replace wildfire with logging. Wildfire is wildfire, logging is logging. There are sacrifices to be made when you log and don't burn. And I'm wondering where the fine line is between protecting the public from fire and allowing fire to resume its role in the ecosystem. That's something that none of these projects have. So what we're looking at here is perpetual management, perpetual thinning, perpetual manipulation of the ecosystem with no place for natural succession at all. So the last thing I wanted to say is, in all the collaboratives that I know about and have been involved in, I have yet to see the resource industries who are involved make any sacrifices at all. Never. There was a killing of a wolf pack up in northern Washington several years ago. What the rancher did was they put out their cattle when they knew there were wolves out there. The wolves killed some of the cattle, and so the wolf pack wound up getting killed. I'm waiting for a rancher who will support reintroduction of wolves or protecting wolf packs or doing non-lethal prevention. I'm looking for somebody from the timber industry who's going to step up and say, we want to protect forest wilderness. I haven't seen it. We can negotiate over logging projects, but one of the big problems with that is we can't control logging projects themselves.
30-second holding record.
Thank you. There's a thing called designation by description or prescription, depending on what part of the country you're from. And what it says, and this is something that everybody who's involved in forestry and forest restoration should be opposing. What that means is the logging contractor determines what trees are going to be cut in these thinning projects. The trees aren't marked, and of course the contractor is getting paid with trees.
Time's up.
So how do we control these projects? That's my question. Thank you.
I can make it.
I know those ranchers and I know those loggers who I found common ground with. We found ranchers who, we think the wolves are kind of neat. We like looking at them, but until we started doing these tactics, I felt like my herd was being managed by the wolves. We gave them the tools to live with wolves, and it's hard. That rancher that Rick just described that was making a mess of things, that were the stubbornest, most conservative folks. And so we worked with the others and we changed the community. And then they eventually came along and now they're doing range riding too. And we don't have the mortality of wolves that we had in Washington 10 years ago. But you sure do in Oregon, because nobody's doing the collaborative tactics in Oregon that we're doing in Washington. And your wolf mortality rate's way higher. Same in the timber industry. I know the folks that we trust and feel good about, share our objectives, and they have bills that only cut small trees. I'll disagree strongly with something Rick said. He used the word, we're using logging to replace wildfire. It's not wildfire, it's fire. For 12,000 years, there were people here using fire at extraordinary rates. There's research indicating that our worst fire years in the West burned an amount of acreage that's about 10% of the average pre-colonial fire year. Fire was extensive, and some of it was wild, but a lot of it was started or facilitated by indigenous people for good purposes, to open up sightlines, to create browse, so that they could see predators coming, so that they could see game that would be more abundant, so that they could gather medicinal and food plants that would grow in those nourished soils. And these ecosystems co-evolved with that fire until a century ago with Smokey Bear. We eliminated that fire. We changed the forests. They're less biodiverse than they are now. So if you have that view, and I'll defer to James to, respond to Chad on the science of it, but I'm bought in on that view of the pre-colonial landscape and what our ecological objectives are these days. Bring the present landscape more in line with the historical pre-colonial landscape. And you only get there if you're using chainsaws on the small trees and reintroducing fire. There's places, there's times you can do it just with fire alone. And that's great. But, I'm not entirely anti-logging. I think jobs in rural communities isn't necessarily a bad thing. I can remember when I hated developers, and now we find we're short on housing. And we talk about the abundance agenda. What are we going to do to create more housing so young people can afford to buy a house? Same thing with timber. If you can agree that some trees that ecosystems can benefit or at least be neutral with some logging, don't we want to work with those timber industry folks that could focus on small trees, that have a good record of protecting the big trees and working with us on the objective of restoring ecosystems while providing social benefits? If you can find the developers and the loggers and the ranchers that agree with you, that advance your objectives, that gives you more control to move things forward on our ecological visions and our social visions.
30-second warning. Thanks. It's your turn.
Well, I spend a lot of time in rural areas in Oregon, and when I return to the places I live, Portland, Seattle, the University Archipelago, my progressive friends ask me, what in the hell is going on with those people out in rural Oregon? Why do they think that climate change is a myth and that vaccines cause autism? The 2020 election was stolen. Well, it's really simple. They live in an ideological bubble, which everything is true that confirms their expectations, and everything that's false that disconfirms their expectations. I don't have to refute Chad's version of the science because that's already been done. I mean, my colleagues and I, there was a whole issue of the journal Ecological Applications published in 2021. It was nothing but presenting a consensus view of forest dynamics. Yes, there's significant variability in historical and contemporary forest conditions, but in general, there has been significant changes to forests over time as a result of exclusion of indigenous fire stewardship, logging, sheep herding, mining, the rest. There are significant acreage of forests in the American West that need active management, forest restoration, thinning small diameter trees, reintroduction of fire. And absent those actions, we are going to lose and are losing hundreds of millions of old growth trees, water quality, wildlife habitat. That's scientific consensus that is precisely analogous to the scientific consensus around the efficacy of vaccines or climate change. Probably everybody here has a college degree and access to the internet. You've used Google. Use it now and learn for yourself what's going on with this so-called debate between scientists such as myself and Chad. The stuff that Chad's pushing is precisely analogous to the vaccine denial, to the climate change denial. The difference, the only difference, is that the vaccine deniers, the climate change deniers, the election deniers are actually wielding significant power in this country at present. Outside of things like this, what Chad's got to say is, it's just not serious. I don't think it's really time for the left in this country to look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, like, I mean, really? Really? We don't support forest restoration. We don't support the scientific consensus about how to adapt forests to climate change. We don't accept the scientific consensus about the tremendous changes that people have wrought in these landscapes over the last 100 years. We're not going to embrace communities coming together to craft solutions that restore these forests. We're instead going to embrace this paranoid anecdotes about, I don't know. Yeah, I've got nothing else for you.
Good. Chad?
All right. So first off, when people make personal attacks, in my experience, what that means is they can't stand toe-to-toe with you and debate the evidence. And this needs to be a discussion and debate about the evidence, about the science. I am talking about, I have lots of studies I've published on this. I'm not talking about my studies here. I'm talking about studies by U.S. Forest Service researchers, entire groups of them, who are being ignored by the Forest Service itself, being ignored by the collaboratives, being ignored by the logging industry and by politicians that support the logging industry. This is a finding from Westminster et al. 2021. Forest Service scientists. Hotter, drier, more open, low-density forests had higher fire severity because of the microclimate, the hotter, drier, windier microclimate created by tree removal, by logging. That's their finding. This was a 30-year analysis. There were 472 wildfires analyzed now across the entire Pacific Northwest, including in dry ponderosa pine forests. It's not my research. My research agrees with this, but this is not my research. Another study by Forest Service scientists, Westminster et al. 2019. Thin forests have more open conditions, which are associated with higher temperatures, lower relative humidity, higher wind speeds, and increasing fire intensity. Numerous other studies. These are all studies by the U.S. Forest Service's own scientists. There are many, many more. Again, go on the John Muir Project's website, download the Thinning and Fire fact sheet, and you will find that there is an enormous body of research contradicting the narrative that's coming from about 36 scientists promoting thinning. And there are hundreds of scientists who are saying thinning is ineffective, that fire is driven overwhelmingly by weather and climate factors, not by forest density and by climate change. And that thinning, in fact, increases carbon emissions dramatically relative to wildfire alone, making climate change worse. Yeah. And the thin forests often burn at high intensity anyway. There's no such thing as a collaborative and logging companies that are only cutting small trees. That is not a thing. I've never found that. I've been doing this for 36 years. I've never found a single example of that anywhere. Yes, they are removing small trees. They're also removing a whole lot of mature trees, including big trees and old growth trees. The typical so-called thinning project these days is killing upwards of 60, 70, 80% of the trees in a given stand, killing and removing them, including many mature and old growth trees. But here's the thing. We don't need to do thinning. It is a myth that we have to, if we want lower intensity fire in a given area, if we want to have fire in the landscape, it's a myth that we have to do thinning in a dense forest before we can burn. Mitch is right. We had more fire historically, more wildfire and more indigenous cultural burning. I support more fire of both. I support a more prescribed fire in certain areas and certain circumstances. And there are lots of ways we can get there. We don't have to do logging projects in order to have fire in our forests. The Forest Service admits this. It is known that tree removal is not required before prescribed fire can be used. They admit the same thing with regard to managed wildfire. They publish studies on it. They also admit that it costs 6 times more per acre to do thinning than to just do burning. So another fact sheet, this is just a small sampling of studies over the past half century that have found that even in the densest forests, you can just do fire without removing any trees. Even forests that haven't burned in a century, even forests with many hundreds of trees per acre. It's about the weather. It's about the climate. If you want low intensity fire, you burn in mild fire weather. It's very, very simple. Last thing I'll say is, again, to get a tiny increase in tree survivability of the remaining trees, they're killing and removing the vast majority of trees. The orange is the ones they're killing through thinning. The green is the trees that would otherwise die but survive because of reduced competition. That balance is not sustainable. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our panelists. Appreciated hearing the different perspectives and getting a little bit of debate there as well. We'll now open the floor up to questions. And I believe this gentleman here on the right raised his hand for answers.
Glad I've had a few minutes to call down. I cannot stand here and not respond to you crapping on what you just did. The idea that Minneapolis is the only example of successful activism, and by the way, it's not clear Minneapolis has been successful. It's been marvelous what they're doing. But all change in this country has been caused by all change. That's just a fact. Excuse me for getting a little personal here, but before I was an environmental lawyer for 35 years, I was in ACT UP. ACT UP is the reason that tens of thousands of gay men's lives were saved. It's the only reason the drug companies changed their policy. The only reason. Anthony Fauci admitted that in an interview last year. He was at NIH when that happened. He admitted they were wrong. He admitted that we were right. And that was the reason they changed their policies. So don't sit there and tell me that activism in this country doesn't matter.
Oh, I didn't say that.
Yes, you did.
No, I
did.
I said activism is broken, that we need to be better. And I've heard Dan Savage.
Activism. Yeah. Exactly.
Was it ACT UP that got gay marriage, or was it the change in
got gay marriage?
The mainstreamization?
Because of the gay rights movement. And I'm not going to sit there and listen to you say that it did. That's just wrong.
Activists need to do better. We need to focus on clear objectives.
We've done it pretty damn well already. And we're going to keep you.
I'll just say that the last general election, I think, was a little bit of
this talking electing is also bullshit. So.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right? But I don't hear you guys talking about how collaboration works exactly. I don't see any data. You didn't give me, Chad has provided a lot of data. And I'm, the civil rights movement was a collaboration. It was a constant effort against an opposition that was intransigent. And that is the logging industry. I mean, that is the U.S. Forest Service. That is really it's the destination of what they're about. It's about cutting down trees. And if Conservation Northwest, I mean, I don't understand why you haven't gone, why you haven't protected legacy forests, right? You haven't protected older forests. There's only a tiny single-digit fraction of them left. So why are we not fighting hard against that kind of thing happening? And I agree that, I don't see these logging projects just cutting little skinny trees down. They want, the state lands in Washington, well, that's exactly what they're doing. They're shoving all the legacy forests into the first rotations because that's what the That's what timber companies want. They're not cutting down little, they're not even cutting their plantation forests first now. They're trying to get all the legacy forests because that's what they want. They want that wood. How do you respond to that?
We involved in the campaign and ran the funding for the public messaging that led to the commissioner setting aside 70,000 acres of legacy forest. We were primarily responsible for the overall policy, 150 years, on DNR land.
You've looked at those 70,000 maps? You've really studied those?
No, but I know that they're also, the Commissioner of Public Land knows that they're not good maps and they're not final. He stole my policy director to make things better. So
we're hoping that she does something. Yeah, but I'm still wondering about the data. I don't know. You guys make an ethical. You make an ethos around collaboration, but I don't see the evidence of how it's working.
I don't cut off. Well,
yeah, I want to add something to that. It's the collaboratives function based on their own interests, the interests of the various members of the collaborative. One of the things that's being done is the Forest Service is doing good projects as part of these big timber projects. In other words, they're doing fisheries, fish passage measures. Trout Unlimited loves that. So they're in the collaborative. They're getting fish passage. They're getting in-stream structures. They're getting all kinds of great stuff with closing all logging roads. But every single time without fail, those are all attached to a logging project. Every single time.
And not small trees.
And not small trees.
The other response before I call on our question? Yes. Here. Yeah. My question was for Chad, just because a lot of the that is contrary to most of the literature I think most of us are familiar with. Seemed like a lot of it was focused on correlation rather than causation. So I'm curious, and maybe I missed it, but were any of your studies there, or which studies would you have that showed that within the same forest that thinning leads to increased fire risk versus I feel like a lot of what you're talking about was that forests that happen to be naturally thin experience more fire. So I'm just curious about if there is more of a causation study.
No, it's a good question. So the studies, first of all, the studies that I talked about here were just a small subset of even just the Forest Service scientist studies. And so these are all studies from Forest Service scientists. I could talk about my own research too. It's similar. But the studies that I had on the list there were a mix of different studies. Some are studies about forest density without regard to whether they've been thinned or not. So denser forest burning at lower intensities, more open forest burning at higher intensities. Some of the studies were specifically about thinning, and so they actually looked at different categories of thinning. They even arranged it by forest type, so you could look at a specific forest type and with different categories: thin and burn, thinning with no burning, prescribed fire alone, wildland fire alone, nothing whatsoever, in different categories. So they run the gamut in terms of the methodologies. But the point is that there is a larger message coming from the data, from the evidence. And actually, for me, when you see that coming from lots of different studies, different authors, and using different methodologies, and they're all pointing in the same direction, that's really, really important scientifically. But for me, the biggest thing that concerns me is that evidence is not being talked about overwhelmingly. And it actually is incredibly abundant. But you would think from hearing from a lot of the Forest Service scientists and a lot of scientists funded by the Forest Service that there's a consensus of scientific opinion in favor of thinning as an effective wildfire strategy. That is categorically false. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are certainly scientists and studies that promote thinning and say it's effective. There are a lot that do not. In fact, the most comprehensive research now is saying the opposite. And that is not my research, although I've contributed to that too. So one of the things that concerns me most as a scientist is when scientists who promote a certain view don't talk about contrary evidence. They omit evidence that doesn't fit their narrative. And that's the case with the study that James mentioned that attacked my work and work of some of my colleagues. All we had done is actually just compile historical U.S. government research and field surveys, Forest Service and other agencies, about really dense forest conditions and present that evidence. And there were lots of different lines of those evidence indicating the forests were not all open and park-like. That was a component, but a lot of them were medium density and very high density. And then the attack against us attacked our initial papers, but didn't mention all of our reply papers where we replied to U.S. Forest Service scientists that had published critiques of our research. Now, when you don't mention that we had actually come back and said, okay, we published papers that said you actually didn't even challenge our core findings or conclusions. You sort of nitpicked around the edges, so you could say that you had criticized our research, but then you don't mention that we actually published extensive reply articles in rebuttal to that basically settled the matter and have not been countered or contested by subsequent research. So those findings are uncontested, and when that's not mentioned by an attack article, that to me is dishonest. At least it is careless. And who knows what the intention was? I won't try to make assumptions about that. But we published a subsequent paper and meticulously documented that there had been a falsification of the scientific record, whether or not it was intentional, because of the omissions of scientific evidence.
Really briefly, if I could, just really briefly. Chad shared some slides with scientific articles cited. Get that slide from Chad and write to those authors. He cited them. Write to Damon Leismeister, Matt Riley, Garrett Meggs. I think I was actually an author at least one or two of those papers. Write to them and say that you went to a presentation with Chad and Chad represented your work to say this. Every single one of those authors will email you back and tell you that Chad is misrepresenting their work, that slide is bogus. I guarantee you.
I will send anyone in the room either one of those studies, either direct quotes from the studies, from the authors themselves. If the authors tell you otherwise, they're being leaned on by their bosses in the Forest Service, but you can look at the studies themselves. The studies speak for themselves. I'm quoting these studies. In fact, they're open access. Anyone here in the room can actually go into Google Scholar right now and Google Leismeister 2019 fire severity or Leismeister 2021 fire severity and find those quotes right now.
Google all of his papers and read them.
All right.
Again, it's not my research, Forest Service research.
We'll have a little reading party after this. Okay. I can put on this side of the net, so there. Right.
So Mitch, you talked a lot about how when you're in the collaboration, it's really useful when people agree on things, and that's how you can push things forward. And I agree, it's great when people agree, but I mean, even you said that only lasts until as long as people agree. And then if you get somebody that comes into the collaboration that's stubborn or has a bad agenda, then everything falls apart. And given that we're talking about, old growth forests, they take, hundreds of years to establish. Once, everything falls apart and they go away, it takes hundreds of years for them to come back. So how is collaboration making for long-term effective change to protect them in the long term rather than only while everybody agrees?
Yeah.
What Chad said and Rick said about all of these projects, cutting big trees and not small trees, we've got dozens of projects that we feel really good about. Where collaborations have soured, it tends to, in my perception, tends to not be the community or even the industry participants that have gone south, but changes in the agency. Either the agency leadership or the administration changes, and there you're getting more push from above. But in Washington, we're just not losing over. There's debates about in a dry ponderosa pine forest, but you've got a Douglas fir that's grown up close to a ponderosa pine, and maybe it's even a wider diameter. Do you want that tree there or not? And those are the type of debates that will happen. And the way my experience is collaborations of the Forest Service will come up with a project. We won't necessarily like it. Industry and us will we'll negotiate, we'll argue the science, we'll reach a common position, and we'll send feedback to the agency. And when things are working, we get the changes that we want. If we have poor leadership in the agency, then we don't get those changes, and that's when collaboration isn't working.
Right. So how do you make sure that the changes that you get when things are working last beyond when things
Well,
not working?
it's always one project at a time, right? You can't change everything. But I would say the important metric is not whether it works to perfection, but does it work better on net than non-collaboration and polarization, which often ends up with the trees being logged, but more, and us having less control of the project and more polarization.
All right, there in the back, Richard. I apologize, Mitch. I feel like I'm going to pile on a little bit here, but I commend you for finding these unicorn ranchers that are very excited to see wolves, because that's never been my experience. And I want to push back a little bit at the idea that we should always be trying to collaborate. I'm not saying that it works. It probably doesn't work. So when you're engaging with people who are talking about going in and shooting the Forest Service personnel that are in the midst of trying to maybe take 2 or 3 weapons away from them, I don't see that being a vital dialogue that's going to be the engine kind of progress.
Well, I mean, we've tried for 40 years to get cattle off of public lands and made no progress. There are people that want to use wolf recovery as another reason to get cattle off public lands. I don't think that serves the wolves well. I don't think, we've found progress in reducing wolf mortality by working with ranchers. We've found progress in improving grazing impacts on the land by getting virtual fencing out there so that you can, on an app with a finger, keep cattle away from a stream, from a wolf den, from.
Oh, fencing is expensive.
No, it's way cheaper than regular fencing.
Well,
yeah, and that's the comparison. Yeah, and fences burn down. We have so much fire these days. Your fence is just burned in a brush fire. To replace it's $10,000 a mile, whereas you can get virtual fence up for $40,000, 3 towers that will cover 100,000 acres.
if you have sidelines, we don't have to get virtual fencing. Just then change my mind. How did you start that dialogue? How did you identify who you were going to?
That's a great question. We were lucky. When wolves showed up in Washington, we already had some good relationships with some key ranchers that we had purchased easements from to protect particular habitat. And so we kind of worked with the more pragmatic thought leaders in the ranching community. We didn't try to work with the most obstreperous, stubborn ranchers who took 10 years to come around. And there's a price to pay. Those ranchers that were early adapters, they were persecuted in their community. They were ostracized. And, it's hard living with wolves. It really is. Even the ranchers that have put the most earnest effort in, there's a lot of sleepless nights. But they're still working with us. And, I think we've got the lower wolf mortality to show for it.
All right, flannel shirt.
All right. This is more of a comment as reflection that kind of bridges the gap between Mitch and Chad on Big C collabs. So I run a nonprofit in Northern California. So this is the experience from 3 different forest collaboratives I'm very part of. One is like Chad's example. It was on Mendocino National Forest, Fire Escape Mendocino. And the collaborative was not really a collaborative. It was a group that was convened by the Forest Service to represent their projects. And then we're also part of the Western Climate Restoration Partnership, which is in 6 Rivers National Forest and Klamath Valley. And that one is largely led by the Creek tribe. And that's been a really fantastic group that has pushed the Forest Service away from the things that they wanted to do towards lower impact,
projects towards things like restoring oak woodlands that were historic first foods for the Krug. And so my reflection from multiple different collaboratives is in part it's the culture of the local Forest Service office that it's going to be important. Culture can change. The Six Rivers and Klamath National Forest still fucking sucks in most respects, but the local district office is supportive of this. In Six Rivers, we brought around over many years of work. So culture can change and culture can stick regardless of federal administrations and can be better. And then the other point is the importance of having the tribal partner where, we're all equal as stakeholders or whatever on our national forest, but tribes are given special preference, and rightfully so. And the crew having the capacity to really lead and having staff that are able to engage in this forest collaborative has been instrumental in making that a truly effective vehicle for bettering our forests.
Here, Burgundy. I have possibly 3 questions for you. One is connected with the fact that during thinning projects, I have to personally contest the fact that thinning projects focus on small trees. I just haven't seen it yet. It may be that I simply haven't experienced it. But given that they occur, I'm wondering how many projects you've encountered where actual field ground truthing monitoring is being done during the implementation phase, number 1. Number 2, has the Forest Service or any scientists that have responded after the idea that was presented that thinning trees is basically killing trees in order to save the rest, has the idea that those thinned trees themselves, the sacrificial lambs, need to be counted? Has that resonated anyway with any of the scientists you're working with? And the third, which I feel is really important and not so mentioned, is the standing dead trees, which to me are the carbon that's like the black sheep of the carbon that's just the carbon family that absolutely needs to be counted because they're housing complexes. And I don't think much mention of that has been made here. So how do the studies you're trying to bring forward that counteract the other narrative? There's an independent science narrative, if you will, with lots of Forest Service, and then there's a sort of reactive narrative going on here. But how does that account for lack of monitoring, the mortality associated with thinning? How does that account for all these? Does it speak to it at all, or does it just ignore it?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm probably not going to do justice to your question because you're asking a lot, and I'm somewhat confused about what it is that you're after. I've probably personally visited somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of all the thinning shows that happen on federal lands in the state of Oregon, which I realize is a bold claim, but I do quite a bit of on the ground monitoring of this stuff. I have pretty comprehensive monitoring in place on 3 different national forests in Oregon that are pretty broadly representative of, the type of forest, the Willamette, the Fremont Lima, the Malheur National Forest, in case you're wondering, pretty representative forests, comprehensive random location of plots. So I feel like I have a pretty good handle from an empirical quantitative perspective. As for your question about how do we account for trees that are killed by thinning, well, that's the easy part. Before and after measurements tell you how many trees are removed by thinning. So we can speak to that with quite a bit of accuracy. Nobody's denying that thinning is killing trees. I think that was kind of the point of the slides that I shared is that, these are trees that are being killed and hauled off to a timber mill. They're as dead as Julius Caesar. Your third point, I'm sorry, I didn't capture it in my brain adequately. If you want to restate the question,
I can, but I'd like to reiterate what I was talking about. So the thin trees are killed, and you understand that, and it's accounted for. but it's not added when the broad picture of mortality after fire is put forward. So in other words, I'm just really trying to think simply, if there's 100 trees here and 40 are removed as thinning, and maybe 10 die as a result of a fire. The 10 that die as a result of a fire are the only fraction that is counted as mortality due to the mortality.
I get where you're coming
If that
from.
was
I took Chad's point as well, and I think that it's just, I'm not sure you're getting it. We are, in fact, accounting for, in all of this research, mortality and the causes of mortality, which can be parsed as insect, drought, stress, competition-related mortality, mortality from thinning, mortality from fire. All of the work that I've been involved in accounts for that mortality and the causes of mortality. We're not losing track of trees that are, again, killed by thinning, which, by the way, is a tiny, tiny fraction of all the trees that are dying out there. There's not that much.
That leads me to my third question, which is that dead trees are highly valuable. And I'm just wondering, because of it's very well known, that documented that the housing complexes of the wild. So I'm just wondering why the denigration for dead trees. But we don't,
Well, I'm certainly not denigrating dead trees. Dead trees are critical components of ecosystem functioning. In fact, the vast majority of work that's being done from an ecological perspective is being done by dead trees. I'm not aware that we have any deficit of dead trees out on Western landscapes, though.
The photos you showed had no
We have a
dead trees in it. There was
deficit of habitat.
What's
Then-
going on?
non-forest.
Working on Panacea is that the market is high for Douglas fir. Douglas fir trees are bringing a lot of money at the sawmills. So they're treating Douglas fir almost like it's an invasive species. That's what they're going after, is the Douglas fir.
I'm sorry if I missed your point. I'd be happy to follow up with you offline or after this, and hopefully I can get you an answer to your question.
Maya, just following up quickly, the vast majority of the studies being put forward by the Forest Service funded scientists who are promoting thinning do not take into account or report tree mortality from thinning. Now, I can send anyone here a list of dozens of those studies. You can check them out yourself, read them, and see what you think. You will not find those data. There are a few exceptions that are very rare.
All right.
What are the
Next question.
Mine sure actually
Right next to.
so I have a different kind of question, given the theme of the law of outbreads. How does statutory directed collaboration affect the collaborative process of say involved with? And have you seen Forest Service change their engagement when they're trying to check a box because they've done collaboration to access authorities and funding?
That's a great question. I mean, the problem between little c and big C is almost like the Supreme Court's famous definition of pornography. I know it when I see it, right? What is a bona fide collaborative? You want environmentalists who genuinely represent our community and are well-informed and effective. You want community members and timber folks who are committed to the process. You want good leadership. But how do you put that all in statute? It's really a challenge. There have been some, positive experiences. The Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act funded, it was a competitive project where collaboratives could bring money home to implement their collaborative projects. And I think we got some good work done. I can't say whether there were bad collaboratives that got funded, that got bad work done. Maybe so, but you've put your finger on a really challenging issue.
Yeah, specifically in the context of the EJA and the categorical exclusion established under EJA for fuel breaks and other vegetation management. There's a 3,000 acre CE, but it can be invoked when there's a collaborative.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that collaborative being paid lip service.
It's an issue. It's a real issue. I'm not here to advocate for fake collaboration. And I think I said it early on. I didn't want to debate Rick. I won't defend all collaboratives. I want to say that you should try collaboration where you can because there are trade-offs, and non-collaboration has costs too.
Thank you.
Yeah, good.
So one of the things you said was around having timber partners be there for us when I guess we're in need. And I know like AFRC, the American Forest Resource Council, they're a big timber group and they participate in collaboratives. And right now they're spearheading the attempt to repeal the roadless rule. And they're using the narrative that, you know, the lack of fire narrative, that we need to thin these forests to say wilderness as a concept and roadless areas as a concept haven't worked and we need to go in and actively manage them, and preservation as a model doesn't work. And they're using that to roll back protections on, I think it's 40 some odd million acres of national forest lands. So, and including in areas like Southeast Alaska where there's no historical fire regime, period. It's clear-cut logging. So do you worry that I guess you know, if you're saying that acres need to be treated because we've aberrated from historical conditions and now we need to treat all these acres to return them to historical conditions, that's an argument for going into the Clearwater and any roadless area across the West and starting to do industrial timber sales in there. So is that a worry? Because it definitely is for me.
Sure. For sure. And there are places in roadless areas where I would support thinning, not with industrial tools necessarily. If you can remove some little trees that are crowded around the few remaining big ones, that would be valuable in that roadless area. We'll probably have a deficit of durable, well-structured dry forests in roadless areas, at least, the few that are lower elevation. But if you're asking, then has collaboration made me generally trustworthy of the timber industry? The answer is no. There's still a problem. But I would look I think there are good players out there. And if we can embrace them and empower them, say inside the agency and in the industry, I think we're better off than demonizing them.
I think the concern there is that they certainly demonize us. And it seems like this is only really going in one direction. I mean, every I work a lot in British Columbia, and every forest on Vancouver Island that's ever been protected has been, to the nails opposition from the timber industry. And if it hadn't been for radical crazies in the trees, doing, like peaceful blockades is the least of it, I think. There wouldn't be any old growth left up there, really. And like, I don't necessarily see that going both ways. I would say activism is the only reason that we've been able to make any progress. And yes, it is, divisive and it is, alienating, but they're doing the same to us.
You give me the opportunity to respond real quick. I don't want to say I'm not anti-activist. I'm not anti-civil rights movement. I thought the discipline that the civil rights movement showed was the key to its success. I think our activist movement could be more disciplined, more mainstream in its focus, and therefore more effective. I'm pro-activist. I just want better activism. And you're certainly right. In BC, the timber industry in BC has a type of clout that the timber industry in the Northwest used to have 40, 50 years ago. And it's a really sad thing.
When you're talking about collaboration, you're talking a lot about compromise. And when you're an advocate for nature, you don't have room to compromise. It's like, for example, the roadless area policy. If you support the roadless area policy and simultaneously support thinning in roadless areas, where is the baseline? Where is the baseline in nature? And how much can we afford to give up if we're trying to protect the last grove of ancient forests in Panacea clear cuts? How can we compromise? We're trying to protect the last of a species. How can we compromise? So if we're collaborating and compromising, we've got our backs against the wall because we're protecting the last of irreplaceable things.
I'm also wondering when you said,
Sorry, I want to give other people a chance.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to follow up.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I will just briefly say that I think of myself as being pro-thinning and anti-capitalist, which means I don't think it very often, but
I am curious about how collaboration, because I see this problem of the large tree harvesting getting tacked on to picnic projects as an issue of the role of market forces in influencing the intentions of these projects. And so I'm wondering about how collaboration and local community efforts to decouple milling infrastructure that is needed to process the small trees that I believe need to get taken out in a lot of woods, without that being manipulated by the broader market forces. So like community ownership of bills, that kind of thing, like all these examples of that. You see that as a possibility for collaboration.
I'm happy to. Small trees far in, far from the mill, they're worth less than it costs. And so you're not going to get quality projects without some federal subsidy or finding ways to create more merchantability, whether it's turning them into biochar or chipping them on site or whatever it is I was delighted when the research came out showing that fire without thinning can have ecological benefit. I think it's clear why the Forest Service adds you know larger diameter trees than they ought to thinning projects in order to get bids. Or the reason you're putting your finger on it's a dilemma, and I don't know there's great solutions. I wish we could figure out more merchantable products for really small trees to help cover the cost of improving ecologically areas.
And for me, the deeper issue is that there is this enormous wealth of scientific evidence going back half a century, dozens and dozens of studies in different forest types, in different forest ages, in some of the densest forests in Western North America, telling us that if you want fire in the forest, if you want low intensity fire in particular, you can do it during fire season. And if you want low intensity fire, you do it during mild fire weather. You don't have to remove trees, even small ones. You don't have to. You can certainly remove small trees, and you can, if it's small trees that are being removed and not any big trees, of course that's a lower impact. But you don't even need to remove the small trees. The science is abundant on that. And so, for me, that's really good news. That's hopeful news, because what it means is that we can have more managed wildfire. We can have more prescribed fire. We can remove and reduce administrative barriers to indigenous cultural burning without having to get the Forest Service involved with planting timber sales.
Did you want to make your final thought?
My question is about if you found genuine, loyal partners in the timber industry in your collaboratives. My thinking here is kind of similar with American Forest Resource Council. I was a law student following the Northwest Forest Plan amendment process, and I watched Travis promise how the timber industry changed and environmentalists needed to give them a break and that they aren't going to try and tack on old growth and mature forests. And then we've seen an administration change where their tone has changed. And I wasn't duped at that point. I knew the number of cases of old growth sales that ARC intervened in to advocate for. But I'm curious, have you found good partners? Or are the collaboratives you're in, are the timber industry partners sticking to the plan that was there in 2024? Or are they trying to welcomely take a bigger bite of the apple now? And I think this just comes down to are they open to collaboration when there's a Democrat or just an administration that's, let's have old growth protections. And they're like, yeah, we'll collaborate. We're good partners. And then when it changes, are they moving away from collaboration? That's my curiosity.
I found Vaughan Brothers to be entirely reliable and consistent over time. I wish I could add 10 more to that list. Maybe it's damning that I can't.
Well, simultaneously, if you find a good partner in the timber industry that's willing to make some sacrifices, while you've got that partner, Vaughan Brothers, which is over where I live, at the same time, the policies we're seeing now are coming from the timber industry. The timber industry is going to the administration weakening NEPA. They're weakening the Endangered Species Act. They're trying to make it easier to log. So while you're collaborating with good people, the bad people are still changing the policy.
Did you still have your question? That's a lot.
Yeah, I guess I will. It was a comment that I feel compelled to make as a scientist is that I was very offended and disturbed, James, by your personal attack on Chad Hanson. It's very vicious and disrespectful. This is supposed to be a good faith discussion about the scientific evidence. When you go to personal attack, that means you're not doing a good faith discourse and debate on the scientific evidence. Dr. Hanson is a widely published forest and wildfire ecologist with dozens of co-authors. And anybody who knows this literature, as I've spent the last 10 years looking at and diving into, knows that the consensus of which you spoke is not the consensus. That there's a huge range of literature out there and evidence, empirical evidence on this. And I just think that your behavior and the personal attack should not be tolerated in a forum like this. That's not appropriate. It's not professional. It's not okay. And you have not sullied Dr. Hanson by doing that. You have sullied yourself.
May I respond briefly?
No. No, sorry.
Would you like to respond? I think that Chad is dishonest.
I don't want to. I don't want to.
Like this is not acceptable. This stuff is just not acceptable. We're here to talk about the scientific evidence.
Pause.
I don't want to respond.
Pause. You made a comment. He's entitled to respond to a comment.
But not with
Excuse me, as someone who's actually speaking, this is an equity violation.
Yeah.
I would expect as a facilitator of this discussion that you would maintain control of this discussion to make sure that these types of ad hominem attacks would not take place.
Pause. I at least needed to have a moment to hear what he would say. She stated that she was open to a response. He gave a response that, he's now going to stop, but it would not be acceptable for me to not at least allow him to respond to a comment that was directly made towards him. Now we can move on, but it would not be ethical or appropriate for me to not at least allow him to respond. He's now made his response. He stated he's does not feel that he needs to continue, but she made a direct comment to him. I appreciate you making that comment. And I at least needed to give him a second to respond. And that's what I feel my unfolded responsibility was. We have time for about 2 more questions if we want them to be asked. Okay, green shirt, I think you have not asked a question yet.
In terms of themes of this panel, it seems to me that a theme connecting both the collaboration discussion and the science discussion is a concern about exclusion. That the sort of what you described in the Dinky process was how collaboratives exclude voices that are raising legitimate concerns about what's going on, about the timber aspects of these projects and the various mechanisms within Big C collaboration that push that out. Likewise, on science, as we've just seen in this discussion, the ways that Forest Service affiliated scientists try and push out science that doesn't go along with the Forest Service narrative. The theme there seems to be, don't look at this versus let's look at all of this. And so I ask for really everyone on the panel, what do you see as the mechanisms that can reduce that sort of exclusion and bring in more of the people who are identifying the problems with these projects and more of the science that's also doing that?
I'll just say briefly, because I know time is short. I would say the answer is civil dialogue that discusses openly all of the evidence. And that's the solution. I mean, we have to have those discussions, and we cannot have folks telling us, don't look over here, don't look at these stacks of scientific studies by university scientists, by independent scientists, and by many Forest Service scientists. Don't look at those because it doesn't fit with a political or economic narrative. That's dangerous. And to have people being personally attacked, to have their reputation, their character being attacked because they're speaking about that evidence that the Forest Service and the logging industry don't want you to know about. That's dangerous.
I think you raised the question of, the panel's supposed to discuss is collaboration good or bad? And it's relative to what? Where are we trying to get? The science question that makes it so difficult. If we can't agree on where we're trying to go, how can we debate whether collaboration gets us there faster than non-collaboration?
With respect to the science, I think we can agree that there is no consensus on the science. But if you consider all the science and you take an objective look at it, right now the Forest Service is not looking at it. Chad commented on a project that we're working on, and he cited all kinds of studies. And they meant nothing to the Forest Service. They didn't even mention them in their environmental documents. But what we're doing with these thinning projects is we are experimenting. It's all a big experiment. And when you experiment, you take a small piece. You don't experiment with the whole organism, including roadless areas. And so that's where I think we need to go in terms of the science, is cut down these projects and do little small parcels here and there with prescribed burning and possibly other measures instead of dissecting the whole organism.
Okay, well, it's 4:00. So that concludes our panel. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. Thank you for
It's